Hello everyone, today our group will present our project titled Exploring the Impact of Intrinsic Motivation on the Effectiveness of Vocabulary Acquisition Among Chinese EFL Learners. These are our group members. Here is a quick overview of our content. Let's begin with the background. Motivation, especially intrinsic motivation, plays a vital role in successful EFL learning. According to some studies, intrinsic motivation supports long-term vocabulary retention and self-directed learning. However, many Chinese EFL learners face difficulties in vocabulary learning, which is challenging and time-consuming. Therefore, it is crucial to understand what drives their motivation intrinsically. This study aims to explore how intrinsic motivation influences vocabulary acquisition effectiveness, and research in this area is still limited, making it a valuable direction for further research. Based on this aim, we set two research objectives. First, to identify the intrinsic motivational factors that affect vocabulary acquisition. Second, to explore how those factors shape learners' attitudes and learning behaviors. Correspondingly, we asked two research questions. Number one, what intrinsic motivational factors influence vocabulary acquisition? Number two, how does intrinsic motivation shapes learners' attitudes and behaviors?
Okay, I'll present the literature review section of our study. First, vocabulary acquisition is essential for mastering the four core language skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Without a strong vocabulary base, learners often struggle to comprehend texts and express themselves effectively. In EFL context, this challenge is greater due to limited natural exposure to English. As Nation in 2001 and others have pointed out, vocabulary knowledge is not just a part of language proficiency, it's a key determinant of communicative competence. Researchers such as Schmidt in 2008 and Wang et al. In 2024 also emphasize the importance of combining both explicit and incidental learning methods, depending on individual learner differences like motivation, strategies, and engagement. Now let's look at the concept of intrinsic motivation. According to Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory, intrinsic motivation refers to doing something because it's enjoyable or interesting, not because of external rewards. In language learning, this type of motivation leads to more meaningful engagement. As you showed in 2011 notes, intrinsically motivated learners are more likely to take ownership of their learning and use self-directed strategies. This mindset is particularly helpful for vocabulary learning, which requires frequent and sustained efforts. Studies like Al-Habshi and Gamlo in 2022 have shown that learners who enjoy the process of learning vocabulary tend to retain more words over time. Building on that, intrinsic motivation significantly influences how learners acquire vocabulary. It encourages them to actively seek learning opportunities, set goals, and monitor their progress. These self-regulatory behaviors help improve both the amount and the quality of vocabulary learned. Printer in 2023 argues that consistent motivation and positive emotions are key to long-term language development because vocabulary learning requires repetition and exposure. Having an internal drive makes a big difference. Finally, we turn to learner attitudes and behaviors. Learners with high intrinsic motivation generally have a more positive attitude toward vocabulary learning. They don't see it as a burden but as something rewarding. As a result, they tend to be more persistent and use effective learning strategies such as guessing meaning from context or reviewing regularly. However, while there's plenty of research linking motivation to vocabulary learning in general, there is still a gap when it comes to understanding how intrinsic motivation influences the attitudes and the behaviors of Chinese EFL learners in particular. This gap is where our research aims to contribute. So that's all of our literature review. Let's come to the next part.
Okay, let's move on to the methodology part. Our research used mixed method research design, quantitative and qualitative methods, which included questionnaires and semi-structured interviews. The purpose is to explore how intrinsic motivation affected Chinese EFL learners' vocabulary acquisition, and the strength lies in that it can capture both general trends and individual experiences. The participants were 60 Chinese EFL learners who are diverse in gender, age, and English proficiency. And we use convenience sampling and snowball sampling to collect the sample. What's more, 4 participants who have completed the questionnaire were invited to participate in semi-structured interviews. And there are 2 instruments. The first is questionnaire. There are 3 parts: demographic information, intrinsic motivation, and vocabulary learning attitudes and behaviors. The classification of intrinsic motivation was based on self-determination theory proposed by Rain and Deci. And the items of the questionnaire were adapted from Dan and Moskovsky and Arabi's studies. The form of the questionnaire included choice items and Likert scales. The second instruments were semi-structured interviews. There are 4 open-ended questions about 3 topics. They are the intrinsic motivation factors for learners' vocabulary acquisition, the impact of intrinsic motivation on learners' attitude and behavior toward vocabulary learning, and a concrete instance of how intrinsic motivation promoted vocabulary growth. And the design of the interview is on the basis of Selampur and Rouhani's study. The next part is data collection and analysis. About the collection, there are 2 stages. The first stage is questionnaire. It was sent through Wenjuanxin and it lasted 14 days. The link of it was shared by social media. And the second part is interview. It was conducted on WeChat, and each interview lasted 20 to 30 minutes. Additionally, we obtained the informed consent from the participants, and we ensured the anonymity of the data. About the analysis, as for quantitative data, we use SPSS to collect descriptive statistics such as frequency distributions, mean, and standard deviation. And we also have analysis of the Likert scale. As for the qualitative data, we categorize them into tasks, and then we had a semantic analysis of them according to the categories of interest or enjoyment, autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And that's all about methodology.
Okay, I will present the results and data analysis of our study, which investigates how intrinsic motivation affects vocabulary acquisition among Chinese EFL learners. About the research question 1. What intrinsic motivation factors influence Chinese EFL learners in vocabulary acquisition? Let's start with the quantitative findings. According to Table 1, participants' main reasons for learning English were fairly balanced across 3 areas: academic needs, career development, and personal interests. This shows that motivation is multifaceted, with both external and internal drives playing a role. More specifically, Table 2 categorizes intrinsic motivational factors into 4 dimensions: interest and enjoyment, competence, relatedness, and autonomy. Among them, the most reported factor was interest and enjoyment, which accounts for 80%, followed by competence, relatedness, and autonomy. However, when we look deeper at the mean scores in Table 3, we find a slightly different picture. The highest rated dimension was actually competence. Participants feel motivated when they experience the achievement and confidence after mastering difficult words. For example, statements like "I feel more capable in English" had high mean scores.
Autonomy was also prominent. Learners felt empowered when they could choose their learning paths and explore new vocabulary on their own. About relatedness, the feeling of being connected to others through language was rated moderately. Meanwhile, interest and enjoyment surprisingly has the lowest mean scores despite being reported frequently. This suggests that while learners believe enjoyment is important, it may not be as strong a driving force in practice. Then from the interview analysis in Table 4, the same four dimensions appeared. Learners expressed that they enjoy the learning process, show autonomy by recording new vocabulary, and feel that vocabulary helps them integrate into the English-speaking community. But again, competence stood out as the strongest factor, especially in clashing with career leads and confidence. And as you can see, this table has many statements to express these dimensions. Then it's about the second research question. How does intrinsic motivation influence the attitudes and behaviors of Chinese EF learners in vocabulary acquisition? Table 5 represents the quantitative results. Most learners agree that intrinsic motivation helps them stay motivated, persist through difficulties, and maintain long-term interest. However, when it comes to actual behavior, such as actively seeking resources or using vocabulary in communication, the scores were slightly lower. This points to a gap between motivation and action. It means the lowest scoring item indicates that independent learning or review behaviors are limited by the time constraints or study habits, and they are not widely implemented. Then it's about quantitative results. From the interview data in Table 6, we see that intrinsic motivation positively shapes attitudes. Learners are driven by career goals, a sense of community, and self-expression. As for behavior, some students to consciously apply vocabulary, watch English movies, and record new words. This practice shows how motivation can be translated into effective strategies, like context-based learning and self-direction. Okay, that's all about my part.
Next is the discussion and conclusion part. For the discussion and findings for the first research question, our questionnaire and interviews reviewed 4 key intrinsic motivational factors: competence, autonomy, relatedness, and interest. Among them, competence and autonomy were the most influential. Learners felt confident and motivated when they felt capable and had freedom to choose. Interestingly, even though interest was chosen most in the multiple choice section, it had the lowest average score in the Likert scale, showing it was less stable than competence or autonomy. For the second research question, we examined how intrinsic motivation affects learners' attitudes and behaviors. Overall, it fostered positive attitude, higher willingness to learn, and greater persistence. However, the level of implementation of actual behavior, such as reviewing vocabulary after class, was relatively low. From the interviews, we identified 3 main behaviors learners used: task-oriented learning, immersive activities like watching dramas, and active review and note-taking. So while motivation drives good attitude and behaviors, however, implementation still needs improvement. In terms of strengths, our mixed method approach combined broad trends from surveys with deeper insights from interviews. Also, we based our questionnaire on self-determination theory, make it theoretically solid. However, we acknowledge limitations like a small sample size, only 40 surveys and 4 interviews, and convenient sampling which limits how far we can generalize. Theoretically, our findings support the use of self-determination theory in Chinese EFL context, especially the importance of competence and autonomy. Practically, teachers can enhance learners' motivation by giving them more choices and challenging tasks, and integrating vocabulary learning with personal interests like reading or drama watching. This study contributes to this understanding of how intrinsic motivation influences vocabulary acquisition. It provides insights for designing vocabulary instruction that supports self-regulated learning. It also shows how different motivational factors affect learning behaviors in different ways, helping educators personalize teaching approaches. In today's education, where independent and lifelong learning are more emphasized, this study offers practical value for both teachers and learners. And here are the key references that guided our research. And that's all. Thank you for listening.